My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Okay, here's the question. What is a disciple? What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? It sounds like an easy question, though it's not an easy question because the Bible doesn't give one clear-cut definition like this is a disciple. In fact, I can remember reading some Dietrich Bonhoeffer letter years ago. I forget what the book was or where I read this, but he said something to the effect of, what is a disciple of Jesus? That I would like to know. Like it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theological giant, admitting that this is a complicated question, an important one, but a complicated one. And yet, in other ways, it's not complicated. Right? I mean, being a disciple is, at the very least, following Jesus. And following someone isn't that hard. It's not complex. You just follow them. You go where they go. You turn where they turn. It's being a student of Jesus. And being a student isn't that hard. You learn, you ask questions, you watch. It's being an apprentice of sorts of Jesus. Being an apprentice isn't that hard. You try and do what they do. You step out on the water like Peter because Jesus is out on the water. All that to say, I think it's this mix of complicated and not complicated, which means I think we can give some biblical definition to it, even though it might not exhaust it. Well, actually, admittingly, this will be very brief. I mean, there have been whole books written on discipleship. There will be many more written, and this is not trying to be that, just some place to start. So let's start with the word disciple. It's worth knowing a few Greek words, I think, in your vocabulary, tucking them away. This would be one. The Greek word for disciple is the word mathetes. You can pause this and say that 7 times over, mathetes, and try and remember that. That is the word that the gospel writers use to talk about disciples. We translate the word mathetes to disciple. But you could also say learner, because actually the verb mathetes means to learn. Listen to how it's used in some extra biblical writing. Socrates, the great philosopher, he makes this statement at one point. He says, and this is the chief reason why it should be our main concern that each of us, neglecting all other studies, should seek after and study mathetes, this thing, if in any way he may be able to learn mathetein, of and discover. I mean, there it is being used to talk about learning, right? Studying and learning. Whatever the subject being learned doesn't really matter. This is just to say the general use of the word, noun and verb, is for a person who is a learner. As Michael Wilkins says in his book, Discipleship in the Ancient World, it is a person who is engaged in learning from someone who has the desired skill or knowledge. Someone engaged in learning from someone else who has the desired skill or knowledge. Now, of course, much more could be said about the general use of mathetes. I mean, it's used in 1,000 different places that need to be gone through. And if you read a book like Wilkins or Dunn or some other ones, you can find all those examples or lots of them. But now let's jump to the Old Testament, to the Old Testament authors and what they thought about disciples and discipleship. So the Old Testament was written not in Greek, but in Hebrew mainly. And so the question then is whether or not there is an equivalent Hebrew term to mathetes, to that person engaged in learning. And the answer actually is that there are two such terms, two terms that seem synonymous with mathetes, and they are talmid and lamud. So take talmid first. Just as mathetes comes from the verb to learn, so talmid is derived from the Hebrew verb for to learn. And it's actually only used once in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament canon. But I mean, that one use is still pretty telling. Listen to this. 1 Chronicles 25, where the noun, again, is used to denote, again, quoting Wilkinson, a pupil in contrast to a teacher or a novice in contrast to a master. Here it is, 1 Chronicles. They cast lots for relays of service, for the younger as for the older. There's the contrast. For the master as for the pupil, the talmid. So there, talmid, the pupil, the student, the learner, the contrast between master and pupil. In other words, then Talmid is denoting a person engaged, again, in the learning process, or an apprentice learning a trade, the pupil, which sounds a lot like the Bauer lexicon definition of mathetes, which we already, without saying it, kind of summarized or made reference to. It's written this way: one who engages in learning through instruction from another, a pupil or an apprentice. So, I mean, you see that those are pretty synonymous, right? The Talmid and mathetes are very similar. One learning through instruction from another. It's close to the general use that we already talked about. Now, how about limud, the other term that is closest to a synonym of mathetes? Limud comes up 6 times in the Old Testament, and the adjective of it is meaning one who is taught or instructed, or literally the taught one. Now, particularly in Isaiah, it takes on an especially mathetes-like force, like people who are taught as disciples or as disciples, followers. So listen to an example. Isaiah 8:16. Isaiah writes this: bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples, among my limud. So that is to say, again, like Talmid, limud is ones who are learning from someone. Seal the teaching among my limud. They're learning from someone. They are disciples of someone. Again, quoting Wilkinson, they are gathered around one individual, either God or Isaiah, for instruction, and that individual refers to them as my disciples, implying this ongoing pupil, master, student, teacher relationship. Hopefully all of this is giving you a bit of an idea that a definition, isn't exhausted, but at the very least, a disciple is definitely nothing less than someone who is dedicated to another for the purpose of learning, for instruction. Like, it's a relationship where the intent is to become like that person, to gain their knowledge, to imitate them. Again, student, teacher, master, pupil, a learner. Okay, now at this point, it would be absolutely helpful to look at not just words, but concepts of discipleship in the Old Testament, in the prophets especially, and then at the intertestamental period, between Malachi and Matthew. But I'm just going to jump to the New Testament now to kind of compare with what we've seen in the Old Testament in the couple things we've looked at. So now take the book of Matthew, which is second only to John in the frequency of mathetes. Matthew uses the term 73 times. And some of the most interesting or telling times that he uses it are particularly the ones where he contrasts or separates his disciples from the crowd. It's interesting because by doing so, by separating them, by contrasting them, he highlights what it is that separates the two groups, and so gives more definition to what it is to be a disciple. So listen to this, Matthew 12:46. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." I don't know if you've ever thought about that verse, this scene, this way, but you have the crowd, the people that are clearly the ones who are listening to the teaching of Jesus. And then you have in contrast the mathetes, the disciples, who are those who don't just listen, but they do what Jesus says, what he requires of anyone desiring a relationship with him. Whoever does the will of my Father. Like the disciples here are being set up as models for what the crowd should be, models of discipleship. Don Carson, the New Testament professor, scholar, he writing on this Matthew passage, he says this is a statement about what it really means to be a disciple of Jesus and to be totally committed to him. In other words, the disciple is the one who gathers around Jesus, learns from Jesus, and not just that, but then does the will of the Father. He hears and he does. It's not just head knowledge. He acts it out. There's many more examples that are needed. Again, this is very brief, but real simply in Matthew, a mathetes, and arguably in all the Gospels, it depicts followers, again, quoting Wilkinson, followers who are vitally committed to a teacher or a leader, and that teacher, leader is Jesus. Like disciples are sold out students, right? Those committed to learning, following, and doing the will of one master, Jesus of Nazareth. James Dunn, in his little book on discipleship, A Call to Discipleship, says it this way: the call to discipleship begins with a recognition of God, that God is the ultimate, the hidden reality behind all reality, the power beside which our power shrinks to infinitesimal insignificance. It's a student, teacher, pupil, master relationship. Again, learning is such a central part of it, clearly, but that learning relationship is so much more than a student-teacher relationship. Discipleship, as Dunn is trying to say here, is total commitment to God. It's recognition of God as ultimate, which really means that to be a disciple is to be a worshiper of God, because he is everything. You are knowing him and learning from him and actually becoming like him, doing his will. It's all in every way. It is such a commitment to being around him, learning from him, doing the will of God, that there is even inherently in it a will to suffer and die for his sake as a consequence of being his disciples. I don't think this is ever clearer than Mark 8, which I think is one of the greatest definitions of a disciple in Scripture. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Listen, maybe we could summarize it like this. The disciple is the one who is completely committed to Jesus, as Carson said, learning from him, being obedient to him, and following him wherever he should go, even if it's into danger and risk and suffering. Again, it's not a simple question, and this is not an exhaustive answer, but I would say that being a disciple is at least this much. Hope that gives you a place to start, and books that would be useful going on from here. Michael Wilkins, Patterns of Discipleship. James Dunn, Jesus, A Call to Discipleship. And then, commentaries on the Gospel. Carson's commentary on Matthew, his commentary on John, these types of things. If there's a question we need to answer, it's the question that Bonhoeffer wanted to answer. What does it mean to be a disciple? Again, hopefully this at least gives us a place to start. Okay, I'll try and answer another question next time and see where it goes from there.